Welcome to Justice at Work, Employee Rights and Protections in the Workplace.
Welcome to Justice at Work, Real Talk with Filippatos PLLC. I'm Lisa Mosbey, and I'm here with Erica Healey-Kagan from Filippatos Law, where fighting for fairness in the workplace is more than a profession. It's a mission. Each week, we break down the rights you didn't know you had, the system stacked against you, and the legal paths that can set things right. Whether you're facing discrimination, harassment, retaliation, or injustice on the job, we're here to help you understand your power and how to use it. Today, we're talking about pay, wage transparency, and minimum wage developments. Welcome, Erica. Thank you so much for joining me for this conversation today.
Thank you for having me, and it's lovely to be here.
Erica, over the past few years, pay transparency laws and minimum wage increases have expanded in many places. Where does the gap most often appear between what the law requires and what workers actually experience?
That's a great question, and there have been many advances in the law, which is great. Typically, we see many great advancements on the local level, right? So on the federal level, I don't think the minimum wage has changed very much in quite some time. However, in many localities, different states, oftentimes cities, they can establish different minimum wages. And so in New York, for example, the minimum wage is much higher than the federal minimum wage. So in some respects, right, it depends where you live and also where you work. But really, the fields that are most impacted by minimum wage laws are the fields where you often see people working at an hourly rate, right? So many of us, right, we have a job, we're paid a salary, we have a general, schedule, but we're not paid by the hour per se. And obviously, there are some ways where that can go wrong as well. But for folks who, clock in, clock out every day, they get paid, down to the penny by the hour. Oftentimes we see that in the hospitality industry, especially for like servers and folks who, kind of work in like entry level roles in hospitality. Oftentimes also construction can be, by the hour, or different types of, warehouse workers. Usually it really just depends. But when we're talking about minimum wage, again, we're talking about hourly workers who, clock in, clock out, and are kind of monitored in that way on a daily basis.
And I know salary ranges are now posted more frequently, but those ranges can be extremely wide, as you mentioned, from New York to a small town in Iowa. What does wage transparency meaningfully reveal, and where can it still obscure inequity?
So it's a very interesting development, right? Because as you're saying, there are ways to technically comply with a law that requires you to post a salary range, right? I would say if you're applying for jobs, I'm going to be super hyperbolic right now. If the range is $0 to $1 million, depending on very subjective factors, I would probably say don't apply for that job, because that company is clearly trying to evade the law, right? So sometimes when you see a very broad range in a way that, almost doesn't quite make sense, that's going to be a red flag for me. Not to say that everyone can pick and choose, a job's a job, and everyone needs to work. But I would say, again, it's a bit of a red flag to see a very wide range without very objective factors, to dictate where you would fall on that range. The more objective factors, which certainly can make sense, is sometimes depending on a person's number of years of experience in the field, they might reach a different echelon of where they'll fall in that range. Sometimes we also see different education levels, right? If you have an associate's, you'll be in this range. And if you have a bachelor's, you'll be in this range. And if you have a master's, right, you might fall somewhere else. Those are very objective. You either have the number of years of experience or you don't. Right. So those are pretty, shouldn't say easy, but those are pretty clear to monitor and to know whether or not there's consistency there. Once you start seeing, a very broad range and just, you will be placed in that range, again, just kind of at the discretion of the company, that gets us a little bit more into troubled waters if we are trying to determine whether or not a legitimate wage was determined, and that's oftentimes where the litigation can develop or the claims against the company can develop, because when you don't have a very objective basis, it's very hard to argue a legitimate basis, which is what the company needs to show when they're saying who they hired and how much they're paying them. And legitimacy oftentimes is, consistency, transparency. Those things are the points that the company often tries to focus on when they're establishing why they made the decision itself.
And when workers start asking questions about pay, whether their own or disparities they may notice, what tends to change inside the workplace next?
Yeah, so unfortunately, it's not uncommon that, right, the factual pattern that you just described develops. And it's very interesting because more often than not, and I would say almost all of the time, talking to your colleagues about how much everyone makes, or even asking questions of your supervisor regarding, what everyone's the basis of everyone's pay is, that's typically not a violation of any law, right? That is, there's nothing wrong with that. However, sometimes we see companies putting into their employee handbooks that that is a violation of company policy, right? Not It's not a violation of the law, but according to that company, they don't want anyone doing it, so they put it in the policy that it's not allowed. That's very interesting because, right, how can we as employees understand, right, where we fall kind of on the pay scale, or whether our pay is fair or not, if we are not permitted to have those conversations? So, as you said, sometimes those conversations happen, whether the company wants them to or not. And it's, very quietly oftentimes seen as a problem. That person is, that employee who's talking, or perhaps that group of employees who are asking questions are, in a quiet way deemed to be a problem. And then again, sometimes things change overnight, right? And what that can oftentimes look like is, for example, an employee who has been working at a company for many years has never had a single negative performance evaluation. They start asking questions about salary, or, wage structure, or how these, determinations are made. And then all of a sudden they get their first negative evaluation. They didn't see it coming. It doesn't make sense to them. It really doesn't reflect the work that they've been doing, that, oftentimes is being motivated by the fact that they engaged in the protected activity of trying to explore whether or not um, the wages at that company are fair, right? Whether everyone is being paid fairly. And so it kind of eventually occurs in the way that retaliation often occurs, which is, right, nothing else changed except the protected activity, after which, quote unquote, problems start to develop, whether it's performance, whether the person is given a negative evaluation, or sometimes they're put on a performance improvement plan, which sometimes people call a PIP. Again, not in a way that makes sense, but just kind of, that these problems have developed. We need to put you on a PIP. Those are sometimes more obvious. Another more subtle example of how retaliation can play out is when people are sidelined, basically, right? They're usually included in maybe big meetings or summits, or invited to conferences, right? They're invited to participate in different ways in the workplace, and then they're kind of quietly excluded from all of those things. Sometimes that can impede on their ability to do their job, or impede on their ability to attract clients, right? So sometimes it is subtle, and it's not always you got a negative evaluation, which is obviously a problem. Again, it can kind of sometimes be more subtle, but nevertheless, nothing else changed until the protected activity occurred. That is the fact pattern that tends to lead to a retaliation claim.
And I'm following along. I understand. I've seen situations like that. Minimum wage laws are often discussed as a floor, but enforcement matters more than the number itself. And where do you find wage violations most commonly show up even after increases take place?
It's hard because as you said, even when the law is in place, if the employees don't know, or just if any given person doesn't know what they're entitled to, it's impossible for us to enforce because if the person doesn't know they're being underpaid, they don't know to seek out counsel. So, I think that especially in many localities where minimum wage efforts have advanced such that the wage has increased, right? There's oftentimes advocates on the ground who perhaps have been lobbying for those types of bills. There's a number of nonprofits oftentimes, especially in places where they've succeeded in increasing the minimum wage, where that education effort is really just as important as perhaps the litigation effort that we could encounter once a person comes to us. But yeah, it's really about educating yourself and helping to educate workers about what they're entitled to. Because if you don't know what you're entitled to, you can't advocate for yourself or others. And I would just say for any worker who, even has a question, maybe they read somewhere that the minimum wage is higher than the wage that they're being paid. It's just good to seek out assistance, right? Contact contact an attorney, hopefully an employment law attorney, but kind of reach out to a bar association maybe to get the name of an attorney, or go to a legal clinic, right? To just ask those questions because the information is out there somewhere, but it can be very hard to, parse out which wage applies to me and how am I being considered, and am I an employee or am I an independent contractor? There's, kind of the panoply of different laws that might apply, and it can be extremely confusing, even to the most experienced attorney, right, to figure out what applies where. And so, especially if you don't have a legal background, seek that sort of assistance, contact an employment attorney, again, even if you have just a question about whether there's a problem, because it's complicated.
It is.
Yeah.
Erica, employers sometimes respond to transparency requirements by adjusting titles, job descriptions, bonus structures. How does the law look at those moves, and when do they cross a line?
Yeah. The law as written very much says those moves are totally inappropriate, right? But just as I said before, that we can only do something if a concern is raised, people need to know that that is, right, potentially a problem. What the law specifically says in most regards is that people need to be getting paid equal pay for equal work. Meaning, if you do the same job or a very similar job on a day to day basis as one of your coworkers, regardless of what your title is, regardless of, kind of where you are on the technical hierarchy, if you do an organizational chart, if you are being given the same work as one of your coworkers, you should be getting paid, if not exactly equal, very close, right? We use the term substantial similarity. So if you're doing substantially the same work as your coworker, you should be getting paid substantially the same as them. Slight differences, if one person perhaps had more sales that year and you tie your bonus to your sales, there are some ways in which there can be some differences, right? A bonus structure can certainly be based on a number of different factors. As we said before, if those factors are objective, they're going to be less likely to raise concerns, right? If your bonus is tied to how many clients you have, how many deals you land, right? That's objective. We know what the number is. When your bonus is tied to, how your boss feels about you and how your boss thinks you're doing, right, on a subjective level, that starts to become problematic. But overall, in terms of your base salary, if you are, again, doing the same work as someone else, you should be getting paid the same, again, regardless of title. And that it gets confusing because, right, you think to yourself, well, I'm a manager and that person is a vice president, of course they should get paid more. But the question really boils down to, what are you both doing on a day-to-day basis? And in that respect, again, seek out assistance if there are any concerns. Those cases actually tend to be they require in-depth discovery because you need to drill down on, right, exactly what do people do on a daily basis, right? What are their qualifications? How much, how much productivity is involved or required or expected. So there's a lot of different factors that come into play. But ultimately, title is not everything, and that's important for people to remember.
To tie this together or bring it all together for our listeners, do you have an example of how access to pay information shifted the balance of power in a workplace dispute or exposed a problem that might otherwise have stayed hidden?
Sure. So it's very interesting because usually in private workplaces, right, private companies, the only way that you would ever know how much the person next to you makes is if they're willing to share with you, or if, someone is it maybe someone in HR, is kind of aware of what people are making, but it's not usually easy to kind of uncover those problems. However, in municipal workplaces such as the city of New York, the since the wages are paid by taxpayer dollars, oftentimes municipal salaries are actually a matter of public record. So, for example, if you work for the city of New York, your salary is public, as is the person who works to the left of you and the person to the right of you, right? You might not know everything about that person's background or qualifications, but everyone's salary is published each year in something called the city record. And so, in some senses, in cases where that information has already been available to us, again, we're able to at least identify if there's a problem. Because sometimes the question of if there's a problem is even a question mark in and of itself. And we have to do discovery, to figure out who's getting paid what. But when we're able to kind of be one step ahead of the curve and already know from the public record who gets paid what, again, sometimes we're able to understand whether there are disparities based on, sex, based on race or age. Just we're able to kind of understand the full playing field before we even get started. And again, that can be very helpful because it kind of removes one step from the process, and it empowers people because it allows people to see, who's getting paid what and understand whether they want to seek legal counsel. The last thing I'll add, which I think has been very important in many ways, is a law that New York City passed many years ago, actually, I think about 10 years ago. And that was a law that prohibited employers from asking about a person's salary history during interviews, right? Because what we used to see a lot was, tell me about your last job and how much were you making at that job? And then sometimes they wouldn't offer you very much more, if at all, than what you were making before because they know you were willing to work for that amount. And, removing the ability to ask that question. And then, as you mentioned earlier, requiring employers to at least post some sort of salary range has kind of leveled the playing field a little bit. Obviously, the employer still tends to have more power than the employee, but we've seen the playing field leveled a little bit such that employees can, assert their rights and hopefully be treated more fairly in the workplace.
Yeah, that's an interesting example that you shared there. As wage transparency laws continue to evolve, um, acts like that, behaviors like that, are no longer acceptable. What assumptions about pay and fairness really no longer hold up in today's workplace?
I think unfortunately many assumptions probably will continue for quite some time, but I think that the more that people educate themselves and again seek counsel when they suspect there might be an issue, the more we're hopefully going to be able to change the culture there. But I would say one assumption that I still think, requires a lot of education is what we talked about before, which is regardless of the title that you hold, and again, where you might fall in the hierarchy, if you're doing the same work as another employee, you should be getting paid the same. And that, to some people it seems off, but that's what the law requires. And I think it makes perfect sense because, right, regardless of what you call me, if you're using my qualifications and my expertise to accomplish A, B, and C, well, pay me the same as other people who do A, B, and C. So I think it makes sense.
Well said. And I think we'll leave it there for today. Thank you so much for joining me for this conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Justice at Work, powered by Filippatos PLLC. If you're dealing with workplace discrimination, harassment, or retaliation, or just want to understand your rights, visit FilippaTosLaw.com to schedule a consultation. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this with someone who may need it. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.